The night air along the Nile settles slowly, like a thin linen sheet being drawn over a long, warm day. In ancient Egypt, most days began long before sunrise, when darkness still rested over the riverbanks, and only the faint shimmer of stars reflected on the water. A household would wake not to the sound of an alarm, but to the gradual shift of temperature, the cooling sand, and the quiet knowledge that work could not wait for the sun to fully rise. Time was measured less by hours than by light, and so daily life followed the rhythm of dawn as faithfully as the Nile followed its course. A typical morning might begin with the careful rekindling of a cooking fire. The ashes from the previous night were never completely discarded if they could still shelter a few warm embers. A woman might crouch near the hearth, coaxing flame back into existence with dried reeds or straw, while the first light painted the mud brick walls in pale gold. Bread dough prepared the previous evening could be shaped again, flattened, or placed into simple clay ovens. Bread was not an occasional food, but the foundation of daily survival, and its smell would drift through even modest homes before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Water was essential, and in many places it had to be carried. Someone in the household, often more than one person, would walk toward the river or a nearby canal with pottery jars balanced carefully. These vessels were heavy when filled, and the journey was repeated daily without ceremony. The Nile was more than scenery or symbol. It was the reliable companion of every meal, every crop, and every routine. Without it, even the most organized household would have quickly unraveled into thirst and dust.
Men who worked as farmers did not travel far from their fields because in ancient Egypt, the land itself dictated the pace of life. Much of the year was divided into seasons based on the river's behavior: the flood, the planting, and the harvest. During the flooding months, when water spread across the fields, some farmers temporarily became laborers on building projects or estate work. During planting season, mornings began with tools that had changed very little over generations: wooden plows, simple hoes, and hands that knew exactly how deep to press seeds into damp soil. Walking across farmland at sunrise would have been a quiet experience. The ground might still hold moisture from the night air, and the only sounds would be sandals brushing dust, distant birds, and perhaps the low complaint of cattle being guided toward their tasks. The work was steady rather than dramatic. Furrows were cut, seeds were scattered, irrigation channels checked for blockages. Each small action was part of a cycle so familiar that it rarely required spoken instruction.
Inside towns or cities, the pace differed, but the rhythm remained predictable. Craftspeople began their day early as well, because daylight was their most dependable resource. A potter might sit at a low wheel, spinning clay into jars that would later hold grain or oil. The wheel did not move with mechanical precision, but with the consistent push of practiced hands and feet. Clay dust would settle into the creases of skin, and over years of repetition, those movements became almost automatic. Nearby, a carpenter might be shaping wood with tools made from copper or bronze. The scent of fresh-cut timber mixed with the dry smell of reeds and woven mats. Furniture was not produced quickly or in excess. Each stool, chest, or bed frame represented hours of careful shaping and smoothing. Even simple items were valued because materials were not wasted lightly.
Scribes occupied a different kind of workspace, one that required patience more than physical strength. Sitting cross-legged with a palette and reed pen, a scribe recorded inventories, tax records, or official correspondence. Papyrus sheets rested across their knees, and their training allowed them to produce lines of hieroglyphs with remarkable consistency. Literacy was not common, which made the scribe's presence quietly powerful. Their daily routine might involve copying lists, measuring grain deliveries, or noting the movement of goods along the river. Children were not separated from daily labor in the way many modern societies expect. From a young age, they observed and gradually joined in household tasks. A child might carry smaller water jars, help grind grain using a heavy stone quern, or watch older family members shape tools. Learning was practical and continuous, shaped by imitation rather than formal schedules.
Grinding grain itself was a repetitive and time-consuming task that filled many mornings. Using a flat stone and a handheld grinder, Wheat or barley was crushed into coarse flour. The motion required strength and endurance, and the sound of stone against stone would have been one of the most familiar background noises in any settlement. Flour dust gathered on hands, forearms, and clothing, marking the quiet effort behind every loaf of bread. As the sun rose higher, heat became a presence that could not be ignored. Clothing reflected the climate. Lightweight linen garments allowed air to pass through, and many people wore simple wraps or kilts. Wealthier individuals might have finer weaves or decorative pleats, but practicality always mattered. Shade was sought whenever possible, whether beneath a palm structure, an overhanging roof, or the side of a mud brick wall.
Midday meals were often modest but reliable. Bread remained central, accompanied by onions, garlic, or beer made from fermented grain. Beer in ancient Egypt was not an indulgence in the modern sense, but a nutritional staple. It provided calories and hydration, though its alcohol content was generally low. Drinking from a shared container was not unusual within families. The afternoon might continue with the same tasks begun at sunrise. Fields required constant attention, and irrigation systems had to be monitored so that water reached each section evenly. Workers used simple devices to lift water from canals, repeating the motion again and again. The repetition could seem monotonous to an outsider, yet it represented stability and predictability, qualities that supported entire communities.
In urban areas, marketplaces became more active as the day progressed. Vendors arranged goods on low tables or woven mats. Vegetables, fish, cloth, tools. Transactions did not always involve coinage.
Barter was common. A basket of grain might be exchanged for oil, or crafted goods traded for food. Conversations were practical, focused on quantities and needs rather than negotiation as entertainment. The smell of fish drying in the sun might mingle with the scent of baked bread. Voices carried across narrow streets, but rarely rose into chaos. Even busy markets moved within a framework of habit. People knew who usually sold which items, and relationships built over time reduced uncertainty. Religion was woven into daily life without requiring constant ceremony. Small household shrines might hold figurines or offerings. A brief moment of respect toward a deity, placing bread, speaking a quiet word, could be part of the routine rather than a special event. Larger temples operated with more elaborate rituals, but most individuals experienced religion through simple, repeated gestures.
Priests, whose roles were structured by strict schedules, performed cleansing rituals, presented offerings, and maintained temple spaces. Their work required precision, but even these sacred duties followed patterns that repeated day after day.
The temple was not only a spiritual center, but also an economic one, storing grain and managing resources. As afternoon light began to soften, some labor slowed. Farmers might guide animals back toward enclosures. Craftspeople cleaned tools or set unfinished work aside. Dust settled gradually as footsteps decreased. The transition from work to evening was not marked by clocks, but by shadows lengthening across walls. Evening meals resembled midday ones, though sometimes supplemented by vegetables or fish obtained during the day. Families gathered in shared spaces, sitting on low stools or mats. Conversation likely focused on practical matters, weather, crops, supplies, rather than abstract discussion. The day's physical demands encouraged rest rather than extended activity. Entertainment existed, but was modest. Music from simple instruments, such as flutes or percussion, might accompany gatherings. Board games like Senet provided quiet amusement. These moments were not constant, but appeared when time and energy allowed.
The cooling air after sunset brought relief from the day's heat. Without artificial lighting beyond oil lamps, darkness settled quickly. Lamps provided only a small circle of visibility, encouraging households to wind down rather than remain active for long. Sleep arrangements varied depending on status, but even simple homes often included raised sleeping platforms or woven mats. Linen coverings offered comfort without trapping too much warmth. Night sounds, distant animals, insects, the quiet movement of water replaced the daytime rhythm of tools and voices. The absence of modern noise meant that rest was shaped by natural cycles. People slept earlier, woke earlier, and adjusted their schedules with the seasons. On especially hot nights, some may have slept outdoors or in open courtyards where air could circulate. Over the course of a year, daily routines shifted slightly with the Nile's flooding and receding. When water covered the fields, agricultural work paused, but life did not become idle. Maintenance, construction, and communal projects filled the time. The predictability of the flood allowed planning, even if its exact height remained uncertain.
Clothing was washed by hand, often at the river's edge. Linen was beaten, rinsed, and laid out to dry in the sun. Personal grooming also held importance. Even individuals of modest means used oils or simple cosmetics to protect skin from dryness and glare. Health practices relied on practical observation. Minor injuries were treated with available materials: honey, bandages, herbal mixtures. Knowledge passed through experience rather than formal institutions for most people, though trained healers did exist. Throughout all of this, the concept of free time as a separate category was less defined than in many modern societies. Work, family, belief, and rest flowed together without sharp boundaries. The day's structure was shaped by necessity and environment rather than personal scheduling. If one were to stand quietly at the edge of a village as night deepened, the scene would feel calm rather than dramatic. A few lamps flickered behind doorways. The Nile moved steadily in the darkness, reflecting fragments of starlight. Tomorrow would arrive much like today had, beginning again with the slow return of light.
In that repetition lay a kind of stability that allowed ancient Egyptian civilization to endure for thousands of years. Daily life was not filled with constant spectacle, but with routines repeated so often that they became almost invisible. Bread baked, water carried, fields tended, records written, each action small on its own, yet essential. Before the first pale hint of light touched the eastern edge of the Nile Valley, life in ancient Egypt was already preparing to begin again. Darkness did not feel empty there. It held the soft sounds of insects, the distant shuffle of animals, and the slow, continuous breathing of the river itself. In homes built from sun-dried mud brick, families rested on woven mats or low wooden frames, covered with linen that felt cool against the skin. The night air often carried the scent of damp earth, especially during seasons when the Nile's water had recently withdrawn from the fields. Sleep was rarely deep for long, because daily responsibilities were closely tied to sunrise, and sunrise waited for no one. As dawn approached, the first person awake in many households might listen briefly before moving, as if measuring the day by sound rather than sight. A rooster's call, a shifting breeze, or the distant splash of someone already at the river would signal that the quiet hours were ending. The earliest tasks were practical and immediate. A cooking fire that had been carefully banked overnight was stirred back to life with bits of straw or dried dung used as fuel. Sparks glowed, smoke curled upward, and a small flame grew strong enough to heat the first meal. There was no ceremony in this act, yet it carried enormous importance because warmth, light, and food all depended on it. Bread was nearly always present, not as a luxury, but as the most dependable form of nourishment. Dough prepared the evening before might be kneaded again while the air was still cool. The texture of the dough changed beneath steady hands, becoming elastic enough to shape into flat rounds or thicker loaves. Clay ovens, sometimes little more than dome-shaped structures, radiated stored heat. When bread was placed inside, the smell slowly filled the space, a comforting signal that another day had officially begun. Alongside bread, a simple portion of beer might be consumed, even in the morning. This beer was thick, cloudy, and mild, offering calories as much as refreshment. Water, always essential, required effort. In many settlements, someone needed to walk to the Nile or to a nearby canal, carrying pottery jars that were both fragile and heavy. The journey might involve a worn path pressed into the soil by countless feet over generations. Balancing a jar on the head or shoulder demanded skill learned early in life. The river's edge was often busy at first light, with figures moving quietly as they filled containers, rinsed cloth, or simply paused to watch the current. The Nile was not only a source of survival, but a constant presence shaping thought and habit. Its annual flooding determined the agricultural calendar,
and its daily flow reminded everyone that their routines existed within a larger natural cycle.
For farmers, the morning's first hours were precious because temperatures remained tolerable. Tools were simple but familiar: wooden plows pulled by cattle, hoes shaped from wood with metal edges, baskets for carrying seed. Fields were rarely far from home, yet the walk to them allowed time to observe the land. Moisture left by night air could be felt under bare feet or sandals. Birds moved across the sky, sometimes searching for insects stirred by early activity. The work itself required patience rather than speed. Seeds were placed with care, irrigation channels inspected for damage, and clumps of soil broken apart by repeated strikes of a hoe. Each motion was part of a pattern repeated year after year, one that rarely changed because it did not need to. During the season when the Nile flooded its banks, these same farmers adapted. Fields submerged underwater could not be planted, and so labor shifted toward other duties. Some were assigned to state projects, such as maintaining canals, transporting materials, or assisting in construction overseen by officials. Others focused on repairing tools, reinforcing homes, or preparing storage spaces for the next harvest. The flooding was not seen as destruction but as renewal, because the water left behind a layer of fertile silt that made future crops possible.
Within towns and cities, the morning unfolded with different sounds but similar predictability. Craftspeople opened their workspaces as soon as there was enough light to see clearly. A potter's workshop might begin with the slow turning of a wheel powered by steady foot pressure. Damp clay responded to practiced hands, rising into the shape of jars, bowls, or storage containers that would later hold grain or oil. The surface of each piece was smoothed carefully, sometimes decorated with simple lines or patterns. Rows of newly formed vessels were set aside to dry, their damp surfaces catching the first rays of sun. Nearby, a weaver might sit at a vertical loom, guiding threads of flax into linen fabric. The rhythmic movement of hands passing the shuttle back and forth created a soft, repetitive sound that could continue for hours. Linen production was labor-intensive, beginning long before weaving with the harvesting and processing of flax fibers. The finished cloth varied widely in quality. Simple households wore coarse linen garments that were durable and practical, while wealthier individuals could afford finely woven fabric so light that it almost seemed translucent. Carpenters and woodworkers dealt with materials that were more limited in supply. Egypt did not have abundant native forests, so wood was valuable. Each piece was shaped carefully, often using copper or bronze tools that required regular sharpening. Furniture was constructed to last, not replaced casually. Dust and reed matting, creating an environment that felt both earthy and orderly. Scribes occupied a distinctive position within daily life. Their workspace might be in an administrative building, a temple complex, or even a shaded courtyard. Sitting cross-legged, they held a wooden palette with small depressions for ink made from soot and natural pigments. Using a reed pen, they wrote on papyrus sheets prepared from the pith of the papyrus plant. Their tasks included recording grain deliveries, documenting labor assignments, and preserving official communications. Because literacy was uncommon, the scribes' ability to capture spoken words as permanent marks gave them quiet authority. Their day involved careful attention rather than physical exertion, yet the responsibility they carried influenced entire communities. Children grew into these routines gradually. From an early age, they observed the work of adults and participated in tasks suited to their strength. A young child might be asked to gather small bundles of reeds, carry light containers, or watch younger siblings while others worked. Education, in the formal sense, was limited mostly to those destined for scribal roles, but practical knowledge was transmitted constantly through demonstration and repetition. Skills were not taught through lectures, but through shared activity. One of the most time-consuming domestic tasks was grinding grain. Using a flat stone base and a smaller grinding stone, wheat or barley was crushed into flour through steady, repetitive motion. The sound of stone scraping against stone echoed in many households each morning. The process required strength in the arms and shoulders, and flour dust clung to skin and clothing. Despite its effort, the task was essential, because without flour, there would be no bread.
and without bread, the day's energy would quickly fade.
As the sun climbed higher, heat began to press down with increasing intensity. Clothing choices reflected necessity. Most people wore lightweight linen wraps that allowed airflow and minimized discomfort. Sandals made from woven reeds protected feet from hot ground, though some individuals worked barefoot, accustomed to the texture of soil and sand. Shade became valuable, and even a narrow strip cast by a wall offered relief. Midday meals were simple but sustaining. Bread remained central, often accompanied with onions, garlic, or small portions of vegetables. Beer, thick and nourishing, was consumed throughout the day. The act of eating was less about variety and more about maintaining strength for continued work. Families or work groups might pause briefly, sitting together on low stools or directly on the ground. Conversation tended to revolve around immediate concerns: water levels, crop conditions, or upcoming tasks.
In more densely populated areas, markets became active gathering points. Vendors arranged goods on woven mats or low wooden stands. Fish caught from the Nile might be displayed fresh or laid out to dry in the sun. Baskets of lentils, figs, or dates offered variety to those who could afford them. Transactions often involved barter rather than standardized coinage. A measure of grain could be exchanged for oil, a piece of cloth traded for vegetables. Familiar relationships between buyers and sellers reduced the need for lengthy negotiation. The atmosphere of the marketplace was lively but rarely chaotic. Voices carried through narrow streets, calling attention to available goods, yet the overall pace remained measured. People recognized one another, understood customary prices, and relied on repeated interactions that built trust over time. The smell of baked bread mingled with the sharper scent of fish and the sweetness of fruit, creating an environment that engaged every sense.
Religious belief was integrated into ordinary routines rather than confined to rare ceremonies. Many homes included small shrines where offerings such as bread or incense could be placed. A brief moment of acknowledgement directed toward a protective deity might occur before a meal or at the start of work. These gestures were not dramatic displays, but quiet affirmations that daily life existed within a larger spiritual framework. Temples operated as centers of both worship and administration. Priests followed strict schedules that involved purification rituals, presentation of offerings, and maintenance of sacred spaces. The temple complex also functioned as an economic hub, storing grain and managing land. While most individuals did not participate directly in elaborate rituals, the temple's presence influenced the organization of labor and resources throughout the surrounding region.
Afternoon hours often demanded endurance. Farmers continued tending irrigation channels, ensuring water reached each section of field evenly. Devices designed to lift water from lower canals to higher ground required repeated motion, sometimes performed in pairs or groups. The repetitive nature of the work created a rhythm that could continue for long stretches without conversation. Sweat mixed with dust, forming a thin layer on skin that would later be washed away at day's end. Craftspeople also used the afternoon to advance ongoing projects. A sculptor might chip away at limestone or harder stone, shaping a surface gradually through careful strikes. The process was slow, requiring attention to detail rather than force. Each mark removed a small portion of material, bringing the intended form into clearer view. Even when creating objects intended for temples or tombs, the daily experience of the sculptor involved repetition and patience. As the sun began its descent, shadows lengthened across walls and fields. The intensity of heat eased, allowing movement to feel less burdensome. Farmers gathered tools, guiding animals back toward enclosures. Craftspeople cleaned work surfaces, covering unfinished pieces to protect them from dust. The transition from labor to evening was gradual, marked not by a fixed time, but by the changing angle of light. Evening meals brought families together again. Bread remained the staple, sometimes accompanied by stewed vegetables or fish if available. Cooking fires flickered, casting warm light against mud brick walls. Conversation often focused on practical matters, plans for the next day, the condition of supplies, or observations about the river's behavior. The shared meal reinforced cooperation within the household.
Leisure existed but was modest. Music from flutes or simple percussion instruments might accompany gatherings.
Board games such as Senet offered quiet entertainment. Their movement across the board required thought but not urgency. Storytelling provided another form of relaxation, with tales passed down across generations. These moments were shaped by available energy. After physically demanding days, rest itself was often the most welcome activity. Personal care held importance even in ordinary circumstances. Washing at the river or using stored water helped remove dust and sweat. Oils derived from plants were applied to skin to prevent dryness under the harsh sun. Hair might be trimmed or covered with linen to reduce heat. Such practices were not purely aesthetic, but practical responses to climate. As darkness deepened, oil lamps provided limited illumination. The small circle of light encouraged households to settle rather than remain active. Without extensive artificial lighting, night belonged primarily to rest. The sounds of insects grew louder, and the air cooled enough to make sleep more comfortable. Some individuals might choose to rest in open courtyards where a breeze could pass freely.
Sleeping arrangements varied according to status, yet even modest homes aimed for basic comfort. Woven mats, low wooden frames, or simple mattresses stuffed with plant material supported tired bodies.
Linen coverings were light enough to avoid trapping heat. The quiet of the surrounding landscape allowed natural sounds, the movement of water, distant animal calls, to shape the rhythm of sleep. Across the year, the structure of daily life shifted subtly with the Nile cycle. The inundation brought temporary changes in occupation, while planting and harvest demanded intense effort. Storage of grain was crucial, requiring careful measurement and protection against pests. Officials monitored these reserves, ensuring that taxes were collected and supplies distributed when necessary. Transportation along the Nile remained essential for connecting communities. Boats carried goods, officials, and messages between settlements. The sight of sails catching wind was common, and the river functioned as both highway and lifeline. For many people, journeys beyond their immediate region were rare, yet the movement of goods ensured that even distant areas remained indirectly connected.
Healthcare practices combined observation with tradition. Minor injuries were treated using honey, bandages, or herbal mixtures known through experience. Healers who possessed specialized knowledge could be consulted for more serious conditions. While medical understanding differed greatly from modern science, the intention to alleviate suffering was clear in preserved records and tools. Death, though an ever-present reality, was integrated into cultural expectations rather than avoided in conversation. Preparations for burial, especially among wealthier families, involved careful planning. However, for most individuals, daily survival took precedence over elaborate arrangements. Life continued through routines that provided stability even in the face of uncertainty. Throughout all these activities, time itself was experienced differently than in modern societies. Without mechanical clocks, the passage of hours was measured by shadows, temperature, and the position of the sun. Tasks were completed when conditions allowed, rather than at fixed minutes. This flexible structure reduced the sense of rushing that often defines contemporary schedules. If one could stand quietly at the edge of a settlement as night settled fully across the Nile Valley, the scene would appear calm and ordered. A few lamps flickered behind doorways, then gradually disappeared as households extinguished flames to conserve fuel. The river continued its steady movement northward, reflecting scattered stars. In that quiet repetition lay the foundation of endurance. Ancient Egyptian civilization did not rely solely on monumental architecture or royal authority. It depended on countless ordinary days in which bread was baked, water was carried, fields were tended, and records were written. Each action, though small, contributed to a system that persisted across centuries. The Nile did not hurry as it moved through the valley, and in many ways neither did the people who lived beside it thousands of years ago. A day in ancient Egypt unfolded with the patience of water sliding past reeds, shaped less by urgency than by repetition. Before the first glow of sunrise, when the sky still carried a faint blue-black shade, the air along the riverbanks could feel almost cool. Inside houses made of mud brick, the night's quiet would begin to thin as someone stirred from sleep, not because of a clock,
but because the body had learned to wake with the earth itself.
Homes were often compact, yet carefully organized. The walls, built from blocks dried under the same sun that governed daily labor, held traces of warmth from the previous day. Floors might be packed earth or plastered smooth. A sleeping area contained woven mats or low wooden frames strung with plant fiber. Linen cloth served as covering, light enough to allow airflow even during warm nights. Before anyone spoke, there was often a pause, a moment in which the household listened, perhaps to the faint rustle of palm leaves, perhaps to the distant sound of someone already stepping outside. One of the earliest tasks involved reviving the cooking fire. Ashes left from the evening before were never entirely discarded. Beneath the gray powder, small embers sometimes survived, and these were coaxed back to life with patient breath and bits of dried plant material. Smoke would rise in a thin line before spreading through the room and escaping through an opening. Fire was not merely for cooking. It represented the difference between readiness and delay. Without flame, no bread could be baked, and without bread, the day's work began on an empty stomach.
Grain had usually been ground the previous evening or at first light. The process demanded strength and endurance. Using a flat grinding stone, a person leaned forward and pushed a smaller stone back and forth across kernels of wheat or barley. The sound was low and steady, a familiar rhythm that echoed through many homes simultaneously. Fine flour did not appear instantly. It emerged slowly, mixed with coarse fragments that gave bread its dense texture. Hands and forearms would soon be dusted with pale powder. Dough was shaped with practiced efficiency. There was no need for elaborate technique. A simple mixture of flour and water could be formed into rounds and pressed against the inner wall of a clay oven or placed on heated surfaces. As heat worked its way through the dough, the smell of baking grain spread outward. That scent, warm and slightly earthy, signaled that nourishment was on its way.
Farmers began work as soon as visibility allowed. The land near the Nile was divided into plots that followed the contours of irrigation channels. During the planting season, seeds were scattered across moist soil that still held traces of floodwater nutrients. Wooden plows drawn by cattle broke the surface in long lines. Each step of the animals pressed the earth down, while the plow blade cut a narrow path. The farmer's role involved guiding both tool and animal, adjusting direction with subtle shifts of pressure. The work rarely involved sudden bursts of speed. Instead, it demanded persistence. A field was covered one row at a time, each furrow resembling the previous one. Sweat formed early, not because of intense exertion, but because the rising sun steadily increased the temperature. Clothing, usually linen, allowed heat to escape. Many wore simple wraps tied at the waist, leaving arms and legs free for movement.
Water had to be fetched, and this task connected every household directly to the river or canal network. Pottery jars, sometimes decorated but often plain, were lifted carefully. Even an empty jar carried weight, and once filled, it became a significant burden. The walk to the water source might follow a path worn smooth by generations. At the river's edge, people moved with quiet familiarity, kneeling to dip vessels beneath the surface, or using smaller containers to fill larger ones. Reflections of early light trembled across the water as each jar was lifted and sealed. The Nile itself was never silent. Even in calm conditions, it carried subtle movement, the whisper of current against reeds, the occasional splash of fish near the surface. Those sounds became part of daily awareness. People did not stand long in contemplation because tasks waited. Yet the presence of the river shaped every decision. Its annual rise and retreat determined planting schedules, storage planning, and the allocation of labor across entire communities.
When the Nile flooded, the same fields transformed into shallow lakes. During those months, agricultural labor paused, but daily life did not become idle. Men might be assigned to reinforce canal banks or transport materials for construction projects sponsored by local authorities or temple administrations. Others repaired tools worn down by previous seasons. The flood was expected, even welcomed, because it delivered fresh silt that renewed soil fertility. In villages closer to administrative centers,
Scribes began their day seated in shaded areas. Their equipment was modest yet precise: a palette with compartments for black and red ink, a reed pen trimmed to a fine tip, and sheets of papyrus. Their work involved recording deliveries of grain, calculating labor obligations, or copying instructions issued by officials. Each symbol was drawn carefully because mistakes could alter quantities or meaning. The act of writing transformed spoken information into permanent record.
Scribes were often surrounded by the quiet shuffle of activity, workers arriving to report quantities, messengers delivering notices, supervisors checking inventories. Despite the movement around them, the scribe's posture remained steady. The repetition of drawing signs across papyrus required focus that excluded distraction. Over time, their hands developed a controlled rhythm that allowed lines of text to flow evenly. Craftspeople contributed to daily life through specialized skills. A potter's workspace might be located near a source of suitable clay. The potter sat low to the ground, rotating a wheel with the foot while shaping the clay with wet hands. Each vessel began as a lump that gradually rose into form. Pressure from fingers determined thickness, curve, and height. Rows of completed pieces were set aside to dry before firing in a kiln fueled by wood or dried plant matter. Weavers worked with flax fibers that had been harvested, soaked, and processed into thread. The loom stood upright, threads stretched taut between beams. Passing the shuttle through the vertical strands created fabric line by line. The movement was repetitive but required attention to maintain even tension. Finished cloth was rolled carefully, its value depending on fineness and consistency.
Markets operated as places of exchange and social interaction. Vendors arranged goods, vegetables, jars of oil, woven baskets, on low surfaces. Fish caught from the Nile might be displayed fresh or preserved by drying. Transactions did not rely exclusively on coinage. Measured quantities of grain or other goods could serve as payment. Familiarity between participants reduced uncertainty, as many buyers returned to the same sellers regularly. Voices in the marketplace rose and fell in steady patterns. Calls advertising goods blended with conversation about weather, harvest expectations, or news from nearby settlements. The scent of food mixed with dust carried by footsteps. Despite the activity, movement remained orderly. Paths between stalls were narrow but navigable. Religion was present in small gestures repeated throughout the day. A worker might pause briefly before beginning a task, murmuring a quiet acknowledgement to a protective deity. In homes, small shrines held figurines or offerings of bread and incense. These acts required little time, but reinforced a sense that daily labor existed within a larger, meaningful order.
Metal workers dealt with copper or bronze, heating metal until it softened enough to shape. Furnaces were small but intense, requiring a steady supply of fuel. The glow from heated metal contrasted sharply with the bright daylight outside. Tools produced in these workshops, blades, chisels, needles, circulated widely, supporting other trades. Children observed these activities constantly. Learning occurred through watching, imitating, and gradually participating. A child might begin by carrying small tools, fetching water, or helping gather plant material for fuel. Over time, responsibilities increased. Play existed, but it was interwoven with instruction. A simple toy could be both entertainment and preparation for adult roles. As the sun reached higher in the sky, the heat pressed more firmly against skin. Shade became valuable, and even narrow strips along walls were used for brief rest. Midday meals were straightforward. Bread was accompanied by onions, lentils, or dried fish when available. Beer, thick and slightly sour, provided hydration and energy. Drinking from shared vessels was common within family or work groups. Temples operated on structured schedules. Priests bathed, dressed in clean linen, and performed rituals that involved presenting food, incense, and recitations. These ceremonies were intended to maintain harmony between the divine and human realms. Temples also stored resources, including grain collected as tax or offering. Their administrative role meant that religious and economic functions overlapped. Afternoon work resumed with determination. Farmers checked irrigation channels, ensuring water flowed evenly. Devices used to lift water from lower levels required repetitive motion, often performed in pairs. The sound of wood creaking and water splashing created a steady background rhythm. Even small interruptions in irrigation could affect crop growth, so attention remained focused. Stoneworkers shaping blocks for buildings or monuments worked with patience. Each strike of a hammer removed only a thin fragment. Dust accumulated on skin and clothing. Progress was measured not by speed, but by accuracy. Large projects extended across months or years, meaning that daily effort contributed to outcomes few workers would see completed.
As the sun began to descend, its light softened from harsh white to warmer tones. Shadows lengthened across fields and walls. Labor gradually slowed. Animals used for plowing were guided back towards enclosures where they could rest. Tools were cleaned, sometimes wiped with oil to prevent corrosion. Unfinished tasks were noted mentally for continuation the next day. Evening meals brought households together again. Cooking fires produced flickering light that moved across interior surfaces. Bread remained central, sometimes supplemented with stewed vegetables or legumes. Families sat close, often on mats. Conversation tended toward immediate concerns: water levels, tool repairs, or plans for the following morning. After eating, some time might be given to quiet forms of leisure. Music produced by flutes or simple stringed instruments filled the air with soft, repetitive melodies. Board games, such as Senet, allowed participants to engage in structured play. Pieces moved across marked squares, guided by throws of casting sticks. The pace was unhurried, the focus gentle rather than competitive.
Personal grooming often occurred before sleep. Dust accumulated during the day was rinsed away using stored water or a visit to the river if nearby. Oils derived from plants were applied to skin to prevent cracking under dry conditions. Hair might be combed or covered. Cleanliness carried both practical and cultural significance. As darkness deepened, oil lamps provided limited illumination. Their small flames created a circle of light that did not extend far, encouraging the household to settle. Beyond the doorway, the night expanded quickly. The sounds of insects grew more pronounced, and the temperature dropped enough to bring relief from daytime heat. Sleeping arrangements were simple yet functional. Woven mats or low frames supported tired bodies. Linen coverings allowed air to pass. Some individuals chose to sleep in courtyards where a breeze could circulate. The absence of artificial noise meant that natural sounds, distant animals, the faint movement of water, shaped the rhythm of rest. Across the year, routines adjusted to seasonal change. Harvest periods demanded intense effort, with grain cut, gathered, and transported to storage. Measuring and recording these quantities ensured that supplies lasted until the next cycle. Officials oversaw distribution and taxation, relying on written records maintained by scribes. Transportation along the Nile connected communities. Boats carried grain, stone, timber, and people. Sails caught prevailing winds, while oars provided movement when air was still. The sight of vessels moving steadily along the water reinforced the river's role as a pathway linking distant settlements. Healthcare practices combined observation with inherited knowledge. Minor injuries were treated with honey, which helped protect wounds, or with bandages made from linen. Herbal mixtures addressed common ailments. Specialized healers existed, though most households relied first on familiar remedies. Throughout daily life, time was experienced through environmental cues rather than precise measurement. The position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the behavior of animals indicated when to begin or end tasks. This flexible structure allowed work to align with conditions rather than rigid schedules. Community relationships were reinforced through repeated interaction. Neighbors shared tools, exchanged goods, and assisted during periods of heavy labor. Social bonds formed through necessity as much as preference. Stability depended on cooperation within and between households. Death and remembrance were present realities, yet they did not halt routine. Burial practices varied according to status, but the continuity of daily work ensured the communities endured loss without losing structure. Ancestors were honored through offerings, and memory integrated into ongoing life. If one stood quietly near the edge of cultivated land at night, the contrast between fertile fields and surrounding desert would be clear.
Beyond the reach of irrigation, the landscape returned to silence and sand. Within the cultivated zone, faint lamplight marked human presence. The repetition of these daily patterns created resilience. Bread baked, water carried, records written, fields tended. Each action seemed small, but collectively sustained a civilization that lasted millennia. The rhythm of life did not depend on constant change. Instead, continuity itself became a source of strength. As the final lamps were extinguished, the sky above the Nile revealed a wide scattering of stars. The river continued its slow movement, reflecting points of light that shimmered and shifted. Within mud brick homes, breathing settled into steady sleep.
Long before the desert heat gathered strength, the Nile Valley existed in a gentle half-light that made the edges of things appear soft and uncertain. In ancient Egypt, the beginning of the day did not arrive with urgency, but with a gradual shift in color across the sky. A faint gray-blue spread over the eastern horizon, and within mud brick homes, the stillness of night slowly loosened its hold. People did not leap from sleep. Instead, they moved carefully, as though the body itself required a moment to remember the sequence of tasks that would once again shape the hours ahead. Inside a typical house, the air carried the faint smell of dried reeds, stored grain, and yesterday's smoke. Walls constructed from packed earth held warmth from the previous afternoon, releasing it slowly during the night. Sleeping spaces were simple: woven mats, low wooden frames, or tightly stretched cord beds, yet they provided enough comfort after long hours of physical work. Linen cloth, sometimes coarse, sometimes finely woven depending on status, rested lightly across shoulders and legs. As someone rose, the sound of movement, fabric shifting, feet touching the floor, would quietly signal to others that morning had begun.
One of the earliest actions in many homes was to check the hearth. Fire had to be treated with care, because creating it from nothing required time and effort. If embers remained beneath ash, they were stirred gently with a stick until a dull glow reappeared. A few pieces of dried plant fiber or dung were added, and patient breath encouraged flame to return. Smoke rose in a thin ribbon, drifting upward before escaping through an opening in the roof. The return of fire meant the household could proceed without delay. Grain, stored in jars or baskets, was brought forward for grinding. The process demanded steady strength. Using a large flat stone as a base, a smaller stone was pushed repeatedly across kernels of emmer wheat or barley. The motion produced a low scraping sound that would have been heard in countless homes at the same hour. Over time, the grain broke into coarse flour. The task was physically demanding yet deeply familiar, performed so often that it required little thought beyond maintaining rhythm.
Once enough flour had been prepared, water was added to form dough. Hands pressed and folded the mixture until it held together. There was no elaborate shaping for most households. Simple rounds or thicker loaves were sufficient. Clay ovens, heated by the revived fire, waited to receive the dough. As the bread baked, its scent filled the room, mixing with smoke and the earthy smell of clay. This aroma was not merely pleasant. It signaled readiness for work, a quiet assurance that the body would soon have energy. Fetching water remained a daily necessity. Pottery jars were lifted carefully and carried towards the Nile or nearby canals. The path to the water's edge often showed the imprint of many feet across generations. At dawn, several figures might be seen moving along these routes, balancing containers with practiced ease. At the riverbank, the surface reflected early light in shifting patterns. Kneeling to fill a jar required attention to avoid slipping on damp soil. Once filled, the container's weight pressed downward, making the return journey slower. The Nile was more than a source of water. Its presence shaped thought and expectation. The river's annual flood cycle defined the agricultural year, and its daily flow offered constant assurance that life's patterns would continue. Even those who did not work directly in fields understood that everything, from bread availability to tax obligations, depended on the river's behavior.
Farmers began their labor while the air remained relatively cool. Fields lay close enough to villages that travel required little time. Tools were simple and shaped by long tradition. Wooden plows drawn by cattle cut shallow furrows into the soil. A farmer guided the animals, adjusting direction with subtle pressure. Seeds were scattered by hand, the motion repeated again and again until the field was covered. Each step left a faint mark in the earth, soon erased by wind or later irrigation. The work demanded patience rather than intensity. There were no sudden changes in pace, only steady progression across rows. Irrigation channels were inspected for blockages. If mud or plant debris interrupted the flow, it was cleared with hands or tools. Water had to reach each section evenly. A missed area could mean reduced growth weeks later. During the inundation season, when floodwaters spread across farmland, these same farmers adapted their routines. Instead of planting, they might repair storage structures or assist in transporting materials for state or temple projects. The flood was anticipated rather than feared because it deposited nutrient-rich silt. When waters receded, fields were renewed.